We are going to start recording our teenage classes, so we'll have those lessons and we'll have that information. So if you can't make it to one of the classes, we will be here. We'll have a recording. One little thing to note, I think next week we'll probably keep it 7 o'clock. But after that, the Monday after, Elizabeth's going to start playing soccer. So at least for that month, most of her games are on Monday night. So we may push this class back to 7:30 if that's okay with everybody. You can think about it and let me know. If we don't do 7:30, I can record it and be here, but I'm hoping 7:30 won't be too bad for y'all, and we'll be done by a little bit after 8. And we'll get able to get started a little, hopefully before time. So Sophie gives me a thumbs up. I hope that's good with me. It's good with her. Maylee and Maddie, you can just let me know if y'all can make that or not. But that's something we're going to try to do as we go through here. I know y'all are the ones that can stay up a little later than everybody else, so I didn't figure starting at 7:30 will bother y'all as much as it may our little bitty ones. But that's all. I just wanted to tell you about that real quick. We're going to start back where we left off last week. If we remember, we're studying about Mark, or studying from Mark, looking at the Gospel of Jesus, the story, his story of Jesus, and what that story is all about. And so we looked at Mark 2, and when we look at Mark 2, there's a lot of stories, a lot of encounters of Jesus recorded here. And one of those encounters, if you'll remember, we discussed, was the healing of the paralytic man, how Jesus did that. Then we talked about how he was changing some of these other things. And what's going to happen is we're going to see that Jesus is going to start doing some things on the Sabbath day, and that's going to make the people who he is dealing with, the Jews, not as satisfied or as happy with that. So we're going to see what the Jews will do with that idea. And so this is going to be where we're going to start tonight. You'll remember last week we talked about Jesus eating with the sinners and the tax collectors, and how they all came to him and how they wanted to, how he ate with them when nobody else would. And the Pharisees told him that he shouldn't be eating with those people because they're not the best of people. That if he knew who they were, then he would really be watching who he's with. And remember, he tells them it's not the righteous that need a doctor, not the well that need a doctor, but the sick. And so he's telling them that he's going to the people who need him and the people who will listen to him. And that's what we're going to sort of see tonight, is his disciples and their idea versus what everybody else, versus what the people of his time say. We'll start here tonight, if I can get it, in Mark chapter 18. Mark 18, and we will look at Mark 18. Mark 2, beginning verse 18. We're going to look at what he says about this. It says in Mark 2:18, now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, and people came and said to him, why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast? And Jesus said to them, can the wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with them? As long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. And he goes on in verse, in verse 20, the days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast in that day. No one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, nor does he patch, nor if he does, the patch tears away from it, and a new from the old, and a worse tear is made. No one who puts new wine in old wineskins. If he does, the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is destroyed, and so are the skins. But the new wine is for fresh wineskins. So this is what Jesus is saying here about this. Let's get back to where we are. Is he's asked a question here. Now, I don't know how much you know about fasting, but in the Jewish times, one of the things they would do is they would fast. They would fast in different ways or at different times. According to the the old law, the Old Testament, there was one day a year that the Jews were required to fast. And a matter of fact, it's sort of interesting that comes up because that's the time we're in right now of Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement. And so the disciples that was the day the Jews were required to fast by the law. Now, what happens is the Pharisees, they come along, and they're a group of people who taught the law, of their understanding of the law. And as they taught it, they began to teach extra things. They began to teach and to describe things that they began to teach and go beyond what the Bible actually said and what Jesus actually had taught and what God had taught. And so what they do is that they taught that you had to fast. And again, to fast means you go without eating. You go without eating, go without drinking for a certain period of time. And depending on how long that was, sometimes it was just a day. And sometimes you see Jesus where he fasted for 40 days. We talked about a few weeks ago that we see he fasted for that long period of time. During that time, you would have drank with this. But typically when you fasted, what you would do is you would not eat and not drink. And what you would do is when you fasted, instead of the time when you would spend eating or drinking or doing something in that manner, you'd replace it with studying God's word. And so this is what the Pharisees would do. And the Pharisees did something that's not bad. They said you had to fast more than just once a year, or you could fast more than once a year. If you're a righteous person, they would say you fasted more than just once a year. You would fast every week. Matter of fact, they had 2 days a week they would fast. And so this is what they're asking. And John's disciples here are the disciples of John the Baptist. They're fasting on a more regular basis. And the Pharisees, they fast twice a week. And so people come and see Jesus' disciples and they ask them, why do your disciples not fast? Why are your disciples not fasting like we are? All right, Sophie, I saw you raise your hand. You got a question, or did you hit the wrong button? Or did it come up right? All right, I'm going to assume that was a mistake. You didn't mean to hit that then. Again, let me go ahead and say, if you ever have a question or you want to ask something, or you think of something you want to share, make sure you go that chat and hit that raise hand. That lets me know that you've got something you want to say, that you need a question. And like I said, I have no problem in stopping and answering those kind of questions for you when those come up. But let's get back to what we're looking at. So Jesus has asked this question: why do your disciples not fast? Why do your disciples not go without food? Basically they're asking, why do your disciples not appear to be righteous like these other people are? Why do they not have the same appearances? And Jesus answers verse 19, and Jesus said to them, can the wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with them? As long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. Basically, what Jesus is saying here is he says that where they're at now, you don't want to fast. You don't want to do without. Instead, you want to partake of the meal. What the idea here about the bridegroom is, the bridegroom is the ancient word, or their word for groom. And a wedding was different in their times than it is now, because a wedding, the groom would walk across town to where the his future wife's father and family lived. The night of the wedding, he would get her at that house, have a ceremony sort of to dedicate and take their vows, what we call it. Then they'd march back through the city to the groom's house, the couple's new house. And there they would have a feast that will last for 7 whole days. And after 7 days, the feast would end and the couple would begin their married life together. So this is what Jesus is referencing here, is he says that when you're with the wedding, the groom, when you're at a time of celebration, do you fast? And typically fasting is associated with sorrow, with sadness, with hard times, or trying to dedicate yourself to God. And so this is the question they're asking. Jesus says, well, it's just not the right time. They won't fast now, for the bridegroom is with them. And then they go on from there. He goes on from there in verse 20 to talk about the next part. He says the days will come when the bridegroom is taken away. And he says when the bridegroom is taken away, then they will fast. What Jesus is saying is he's referencing here, and this is something the disciples and apostles don't realize this time, is he's talking about when he dies. He's talking about that when he dies and he's gone, then the disciples are going to fast. And we'll see that in the book of Acts. When we read the book of Acts and other places, the disciples fasted, the disciples prayed, the disciples didn't have this time of rejoicing. And that was because the bridegroom was gone. The one they were waiting for wasn't there anymore. And so then Jesus begins to teach some important things. You notice verse 21, 22 tells us something that we may not know much about, but it teaches a very important thought. It says, no one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. If he does, the patch tears away from it, the new from the old, and a worse tear is made. What Jesus is saying here is he's foreshadowing, telling what's coming about his life, about what's going to happen with him. Because he's saying that his apostles are going to bring in a new era. Is going to bring in a new kingdom, that kingdom he's been proclaiming, that kingdom he's been teaching. And that when that kingdom comes, it's going to be like someone who takes an old garment, an old shirt, and puts a patch over it. And this is the idea that putting a patch in a shirt. Now, we don't do that as much anymore because we live in a day and age where clothing is not as expensive and not as hard to come by. So when we have something that rips or tears, to us is almost easier in most cases to throw that old garment away and get a new garment. But in their time, if you had a hole wearing in your cloak or your garment, you would have to fix it. But what you would do when you fix it, you didn't want to put a piece of fabric on the garment that had never been shrunk. That was brand new. I don't know if y'all have had this or heard your mama's talking about it. But have you ever bought a new shirt and you try it on in the store, and maybe you wear it the first time and it fits good and don't have any problems? Then after your mama or you wash it the first time, and after you wash it and dry it, you put it back on, it's a little bit smaller. That's the idea of a new cloth, a new garment, or new fabric, is when it's new, it's not shrunk yet. And when you go through the washing process, it'll shrink a little bit. And what Jesus says, if you put a new piece of fabric on the old fabric and not letting it shrink first and put it in there, that when you do wash it, it's going to shrink and tear it away. It's going to cause a bigger hole. It's going to make it worse than what it was before. And you're basically going to have to throw the garment away. And what he's saying here again is that something new is coming. It's going to change everything. The same with the wine. Now, the idea of, again, the wine, we don't know as much as they did, but they had wine that they would make every year. And you had to go through a special process for wine. And one of the things wine would do is it would ferment. What that means is a chemical reaction, cause gas to bubble in that wine. And what would happen is you'd put it in a wine skin, which is a piece of leather or a sack of leather or a sack of something like that. And you'd pour the wine in there. And as the wine fermented, the bag would expand. And the bag would grow up. And what you did is you put leather in there that was new. You put a wineskin that was new, and it would stretch. You'd use a certain kind of wineskin, a certain kind of skin, and it would stretch with the ferment. And then after it fermented, it would shrink back down to normal, and your wine would be fine. You'd be able to have your container for your wine. Well, if you took an old wineskin, one that had already been stretched and went back out, that has been not used in a while, what Jiz's saying, that one, when you fill it up and it tries to expand, it's going to break because it's already molded, it's already fermented and become hard into what it's trying to do. So what Jesus is saying is that instead you have to put your new wine in a new wineskin. And again, what he's saying here, and this is what you get, you may not understand any of that. I hope you understand some of it. But what he's saying is that there's something new coming. There's something new that is on the horizon that's going to change all this. And he's talking about the New Testament. He's talking about the church. He's talking about his life and about what he's going to do and what he's going to accomplish. And so he's telling them that this is what's going to happen. This is what's going to occur. And so this is this is one of the encounters Jesus has with these Jews. He had the earlier one about the paralytic man when they layer him down, and he asked about is it easier for they forgive sins or take the man up. Then after that, he had the discussion with them. Sorry, he had the discussion with them about the sinners and tax collectors, if they could be there. Now he's questioned about the fasting. The next one he's going to be questioned about is the Sabbath. What should one do on the Sabbath? Now, let's pick back up in verse 23, and let's read through these verses to the end of chapter 2, and then we'll talk about it. One Sabbath, he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did? When he was in need and was hungry, and he and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar, the high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him. And he said to them, the Sabbath was not made for man. Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." What's happening here is this. I want you to understand what the Sabbath is. Sabbath is Saturday. This was the Jewish holy day. This was, how we go to church on Sunday, they would do it on Saturday. And part of God's law to them in the time of Moses was that they were to honor the Sabbath. They were to keep the Sabbath. And part of keeping the Sabbath was that they were not supposed to do any work. They were not supposed to do any labor on the Sabbath. What it would be is that if you got ready for Saturday, you can imagine how we do Sunday, that if you couldn't cook. So what the parents and the adults would have to do, and even the young girls, teenagers, y'all's age, they would have to cook the meal on Friday, and they would have to cook enough food that they could eat all day Saturday without cooking to break the Sabbath law. And so this is what they would do, and they were not told to work. Now, the question is, what is considered work or what is considered labor? Well, the Pharisees, again, the group of the Jews who developed a strict teaching, developed a very strict idea of what it meant to be a Jew, they said that any kind of work you did that would be against the law. They went further than God did. And they even went as far to say how far you could travel. God told the Jews not to travel on the Sabbath day, not to go make a long journey. Well, these guys decided, well, what is a Sabbath? They mapped it out. They said you can only go 3/4 of a mile from your house or from where you started the Sabbath day. So these Pharisees, and when we read the Pharisees, they were a very peculiar group. They had everything down to a science, down to the strict rule, down to a certain spot. And so they believed that the Sabbath, that's what you're supposed to do on the Sabbath. And so they see the disciples plucking grain. Now, what this is the grain fields where people would plant their field, and they would plant their grain. And what they would do is the law of Moses, God's law, would give a stipulation of the fields for what was supposed to happen to take care of the poor. When you were harvesting your field, you were supposed to leave a strip near the edge of the road. And what this was for the poor, the traveler, and the weak who were traveling through, that they could come and they could harvest what was on the side, and that would be their food. Or they could, if you were harvesting and you dropped some grain, if you left something behind, you were not to go back and get it. You were to leave it for the poor. And so what's happening is the disciples are walking down the road with Jesus on the Sabbath. They're traveling. And as they go, they see these grains on the side of the road, this wheat, and it has a big head on it that they would eat, sort of like sunflower seeds or peanuts, from my understanding. And they would take this and they would take the head off the grain. They would start eating it. And so the Pharisees see this and they get upset and they say, well, what are you doing? This is not right. This is against the law. And this is their problem with Jesus. They're saying what he's doing is against God's word, against what God intended for the Sabbath. And so Jesus flips this back around on them because they say they're supposed to be people who know the law. And so he asks them about, have you never read what David did? And he tells a story about David. One time when David was running from King Saul, David runs into one of the priests. He goes to the tabernacle where the priests were. And this is the priest that was there was Abiathar. His father was the high priest, and Abiathar was about to be priest, had just taken over. And he goes in and tells them who he is and demands for food. And what they do is they tell them the only food they have is this bread of the presence. Now, the bread of the presence is the bread, also called showbread. This was bread that was in the tabernacle, bread that was in the temple, that every week there was a certain group of priests who had to fix 12 loaves or 12 pieces of bread. And they would set it on a certain table. And that was the table. And this was supposed to be an offering to God. And basically what David is David comes in and demands food and tells him he needs food because he's about to starve. And the priests say that the showbread is the only food we've got left, the only food we got available. And so the priest gives David the showbread. And not only that, he takes Goliath's sword. Now, that's another story for another time, but this is what David does. And Jesus says that David does this, and if David did did what was unlawful because he was in a human need, he says what was the better thing to do. It's the end of this, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and also gave it those who are with him. And the idea is that these Pharisees did not condemn David, did not say David was wrong, did not say David was the sinner that could not be redeemed. But instead, they esteemed David as being the high king, the man after God's own heart. And so Jesus said, how can you say what David did is okay, but yet when my disciples eat because they're hungry in the same situation, they are unlawful. They're not doing what you command according to the law. And so this is why he says to them in verse 27, he reminds them the Sabbath was not made for man, or the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, meaning that man is greater than the Sabbath. And this is what we're going to see in the next story when we go into chapter 3, that Jesus is going to show these men and these Jews that the Sabbath didn't mean the Sabbath was this great day you couldn't do anything, this great day that you couldn't do anything at all, or else you would offend God and God would strike you down. But instead, the Sabbath served a purpose. The Sabbath was a day of rest. It was a day that mankind was supposed to stop, and mankind was supposed to rest for God. God insinuates that, or gives us that first weekend, or first weekend, when he gives us the Sabbath, when he tells the men to rest, or tells the people, the Jews, to rest on the Sabbath. And so Jesus is saying that Sabbath was made for man, meaning man was greater. Therefore, what he's saying is that if man has a need that has to be done on the Sabbath, he's not breaking the Sabbath. He's not doing something unlawful. And so this is the argument he has with the Pharisees. And again, verse 28, he says, so the Son of Man is Lord even on the Sabbath, or even of the Sabbath, meaning that the Son of Man is Lord of everything. He's Lord of all mankind, and not only the Lord of all mankind, but also the Lord on the Sabbath. He has the power to dictate what can and what cannot be done because he's speaking and operating in God's power. And if he's doing something against God's will and against God's power, then God's going to take that power away from him. So this is what Jesus is saying, and this really sets up the next chapter. Give me 1 second to swap this over, and we will look at chapter 3. Because chapter 3 sort of picks up in this same mindset of the Sabbath. And we'll talk about the first 6 verses of Mark 3, and then I promise you we'll be done for tonight. So here we go to Mark 3. After this encounter with the Pharisees, Jesus comes again. Again, it says, again, he entered the synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand. And they watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man with the withered hand, come here. And he said to them, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill? But they were silent. And he looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. So what we see here is, again, Jesus is in the synagogue. The synagogue was similar to maybe a church gathering, a church building. They would have a big open amphitheater where they would gather every Saturday. They'd have synagogue service. They would have singing, they would have praying, they'd have reading and teaching. They'd have someone who stood up and read or stood up and read from the law, a scroll, and then they'd have somebody sit down and teach. And so Jesus is here at the synagogue. Again, there's a good possibility that Jesus is either teaching in this synagogue, or maybe he seems to be one they've asked to come up and teach at the synagogue. And as he's there, there's a man with a withered hand. Now, the idea of what a withered hand is, we don't know. It may be someone with some kind of disease that shrinks the hand up. Could very well be someone, I don't know if you've seen somebody maybe has a stroke and they've got a hand they can't use. That kind of idea. Anyway, is a noticeable problem with the hand. They've got a hand they're not able to use anymore, and they are going to, they're here for the service. And they're here listening to Jesus. And so the Pharisees, again, we're going to see is mentioned a little later. They're here again watching Jesus. Now, this is the mindset of the Pharisees. They're watching Jesus to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. And you notice they see if he would heal on the Sabbath so they could accuse him. They're not here to see if he can heal on the Sabbath, see if he can prove himself to be the Son of God. They're not here to see if he'll heal to prove just how powerful and how great he is and how wonderful God he is, but they want to have a reason to accuse him, a reason to tear him down. And part of that is because of jealousy, because all the people are coming to Jesus. They used to come to the Pharisees and Sadducees, but now they come to Jesus to be taught. And they listen to Jesus and what he says above what they say. And so they watch Jesus and try to figure out if they can accuse him. And then you notice verse 3, Jesus said to the man with the withered hand, he's a come here. Again, the idea is that Jesus is in front of this crowd, probably teaching and sitting in front, and he calls this guy to the front for everybody to see him. He wants everybody to see and to notice what he's about to do. But before he heals him, he tests the people. He tests the Pharisees. He asks them, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm? To save life or to kill? He basically goes back to that idea of what can you do on the Sabbath? Okay, can y'all hear me now? Are y'all still here? Somebody give me a thumbs up if you can hear me.
Yes.
Okay, good. Sorry, I don't know what happened to my internet there. We're gonna get back here. We'll get back, finish these last few verses, then we'll be done for tonight. All right. So Jesus calls the man with withered hand up to him. He tells him to come back to him, to come up to him. He comes and he asks this question, and I don't know where you lost me or not, but he asks the question: is it lawful to do good or evil on the Sabbath? Basically, what he's doing is he's asking them, what can man do on the Sabbath? What is your interpretation of what God has said? And again, they would say, depending on who you talk to, they fought over whether or not it was right to help an animal. Some Pharisees said that if you had an animal that fell into a ditch, you had to leave that animal in the ditch till Monday or Sunday. Then you could get it out. Or if you had a animal that was about to give birth, and because giving birth or helping an animal give birth is a very laborious process, they would say you've got to wait. You cannot give that. You cannot help that animal with the birthing process. Instead, you've got to let it go on its own. And what would happen is usually the animal would die if left alone and the birthing process didn't go perfectly. So what Jesus is asking here is he's asking, what can we do on the Sabbath? Is it right to heal? Or is it right to do good? what should you do? And again, the question is, what should you do even with your own man? How can you take care of him? What's more important, doing the Sabbath or obeying the Sabbath as you see it, or is it better to do good when you can? And we know the answer to that's going to be to do good, to save a life. It's much better to save life and take care of life than it is to bypass it and leave it. It's sort of like the story of the Good Samaritan, where the priest and the Levite leave him on the side of the road because they're too busy. But the Samaritan stops and helps them. And again, this goes back to where Mark ends that chapter 2 in saying that the Sabbath is made for man, Sabbath is made for man, not man for the Sabbath, showing that it's okay to heal. And then you notice that their replies are silent. They don't say anything because they know Jesus has them. And Jesus, we get a very interesting response from Jesus when they're silent and they refuse to answer Jesus. Jesus gets angry. Notice verse 5, and he looked around at them with anger and grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, stretch out your hand. Now, we see something very interesting here. We look at this and say, now, we know Jesus was a sinless, perfect Son of God, but yet here it says he is angry with them. We look at the Bible where it says we're not supposed to be angry and not supposed to be angry with each other and to react in an angry way. The idea here is that Jesus is angry, but he doesn't act out rashly in anger. We sometimes think about when we get mad, there's some kind of reactions we have. We can have a reaction like Jesus. We get angry, but we don't let it go. We don't say anything. We don't lash out in anger. And then there's other times we get angry at somebody for doing something and we just let them have it. When we let our anger go uncontrolled, that's when we sin. That's when we do evil. And so Jesus here sees them. He's mad at them. He's upset at them because they have this choice to say, yes, man's life is valuable and it's greater than keeping this tradition. And these guys don't agree with him. They don't say anything. And you notice he says again, he's grieved at the hardness of their heart. He grieved at how little they care about their fellow man. And then he looks at the man with the withered hand who's standing here, probably trying to figure out what's going on. And he tells him to stretch out your hand. And again, this is an amazing thing, is this guy who had a physical deformity had a hand that something was wrong with it, that you could physically see and tell there's something wrong with it. And Jesus says, stretch it out. And this guy probably hadn't stretched his hand out in years, probably hadn't been able to move it, but he does it. And as he does it and when he does it, his hand is completely healed. It's restored back to where it was. And again, notice this healing is instantaneous. It's not a delayed healing. And we talked about this before, that some people today who claim to be able to heal, they'll heal people, but give it a little time and they'll get better. They'll say, take your time with it. But these miracles happen and immediately the people could tell that there was something different, that there was a healing here. And so Jesus does this. And the Pharisees and the Sadducees that they're sitting here, the Pharisees especially here, are in a spot. Because what are they going to say? Are they going to stand up and tell Jesus he did wrong in that he healed this man on the Sabbath? Why didn't he just wait another day? Could he not wait a little bit longer? And Jesus is going to turn he's going to turn it back on them and say, well, why would I wait? Again, remember his question. On the Sabbath, on the holy day, is it better to do good or evil? And in Jesus's case, his ability to do good was the healing of this man. And the other thing about this shows us Jesus' authority, that this was God's plan, that this was okay, in that Jesus was able to do this healing. If God had intended the law to be followed like the Pharisees said, in that they couldn't do hardly anything at all that was labor in any way, then this miracle would have failed. This miracle wouldn't have worked. But instead, this miracle worked. Therefore, God was showing his approval that what Jesus said was right, that the Sabbath day is more than just tradition. It's more than just keeping in or coming along with your rules and following them above all else. That Sabbath day is worried about the people. And so as soon as this happens, verse 6, and we'll talk about this verse and be done, the Pharisees leave. The Pharisees hear what Jesus said, and they get frustrated. And they go to a group called the Herodians. Now, the Herodians are a group that we've not read about so far. They're only mentioned a few times in the Bible. But what the Herodians are is that they are following after a man named Herod. Now, if you know your Bible history, you know Bible of the New Testament, you know King Herod. You'll remember there's King Herod that's on the throne of Israel and Samaria for quite a bit of while. You'll remember Jesus' birth story in Matthew chapter 1 that it's King Herod the Great. It's King Herod the Great who kills all the newborn babies. Then after him, another son of Herod comes into power. Then there's another Herod that comes into power. Even to the time of the apostles in the early church, there's Herods on the throne. They sort of passed down the name of Herod. And what happens is there's a group of Jews who were friends of Herod. And these are the Herodians. Now the Pharisees, they hated the Herodians because the Herodians were a group. They were under Herod, and Herod was a king appointed by Rome. And remember, the history is that the Romans come in and conquered Jews, and they took over the Jewish nation. Again, it's about like, say, Russia came to America and conquered it. And Russia set up a governor over our area. And we said there was a group of people in the church who was buddies with the governor of Mississippi, who was a Russian sympathizer. And the rest of us, there's another group of us who were very dedicated to the United States. And we believe we ought to be able to reign ourselves and rule ourselves. You can imagine the tension that would be there. Even some of the tension we have today could be very well described in the same way. But this is how the Pharisees were. And I say all that to say this. This shows how desperate the Pharisees were in that they went to the Herodians. And the reason they did this is because in their time, because the Romans had complete control, they could not put anybody to death. They couldn't sentence someone to death and carry out the death penalty. If they did, then Rome would come in and conquer them again and take away what liberties they had. So they had to figure out a way to get rid of Jesus, to kill him, but have the state behind it. And the reason they do that, and that's the reason why they get the Herodians. They get these Jews who are buddied with the government who can help them get the government to kill Jesus. And this is very interesting because this, again, is apparently very early in Jesus' 3 or 4 year ministry, but yet they're already looking to kill him. They're looking to destroy him. And they look to destroy him because they look to destroy Jesus because that's the only way they can get the people to stop listening to him. That's the only way they think they can beat him. That's the easiest way, is to let the government show that he's a traitor, let them kill him. And then the Pharisees can take back over where they want to be. And so this is this interesting encounter. And what we're going to see next week is we're going to see Jesus is going to pick back in verse 7, and Jesus is going to deal with the crowds. This sort of ends Mark's interpretation or Mark's discussion of Jesus and these Pharisees arguing over the Sabbath. There have been 3 or 4 encounters or 5 encounters that deal with Jesus and the Pharisees coming to head, and a lot of them had to do with the Sabbath. And Jesus is showing them that their understanding of the law, that the law was a rule that you had to follow to the fine detail, and there was no give to that law, that wasn't true. That wasn't how God's law worked, and it's still not the way God's law works today. Yes, there are things we're required to do, but it doesn't mean we have to follow it. And if you veer off the little bit from that, you've lost it. You've turned away. And that's something that as Christians we have to learn. I know some of you are Christians so far, and some of you are not. But you have to learn that in your Christian life, that just because every little mistake we make, doesn't mean that we're condemned. It doesn't mean we're lost. It depends on how we react to that sin. Do we stay in that sin, or do we get out of it? Because, see, the Pharisees were the type where they had a strict rule. They had a strict law. You have to do this, this, and this. If you do anything besides those fine points, then you were condemned. There was no hope for you. You had to repent. You had to make it right, if you can make it right, but you were a lawbreaker. And Jesus is saying, no, there's things that are more important than your idea, your tradition. There's more to obeying these laws than following out the details. There's the heart involved. And that's what we're going to see Jesus is going to talk about. Because as you see here, Jesus is more worried about the heart as more than actions. And the reason for that is because if the heart is right, then the actions will be right. If your heart is where it needs to be, then your actions will follow through. And that's what we see by these Pharisees. Many times when Jesus sees them, he hears their heart, he looks at their mind, and he realizes they've got this hardness. They've got this unwilling to compromise, unwilling to help anyone else out. And therefore, he condemns them. Therefore, he tells them over and over again, you're not doing the law right. You've got to follow it with your heart, and you've got to do it. You got to obey it, but you got to have the right heart to it. You got to have that right mentality. And so that's where we leave this story, or this gospel tonight. We're going to stop here at verse 6, pick up next week in verse 7. Anybody got a question or comment real quick? All right, I'm going to stop the recording. Again, appreciate everyone being here and coming with us. We'll see you all next Monday night at 7 o'clock.